So we're going to get into now the next step. Once you've had the opportunity to practice, what we want to do is we want to get into Act 3, which is the closing. Now, if you look at your sheet that you can download, this is on the right-hand side, the last third. The principles of closing essentially are that we're looking at understanding what it is we're selling. I've mentioned this before, but what I want to do is I want to talk about selling the value of the appointment more so than just selling the value of the treatment. We want to talk also about offering broad to narrow options. The principle of helping people make decisions is much easier that way. We want to deliver dates and times first. I want to make sure we cover that. I want to talk a little bit about how you get a commitment before you get a transaction. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about making a proposal, how that sounds. And then at that point, you can be prepared to handle any objections that are thrown your way. So I think that what's also very important is to remember when to share information that is tangential to the selling aspect of what you're doing, to focus on delivering that information after. For example, location, directions, how the appointment actually happens, how it works, who they see. That all can happen in terms of discussion after you've actually closed the appointment, got a date and a time. And then from there, we'll be able to be a bit more clear in terms of what has to happen next. So let's get into the idea of selling the appointment, not holding the appointment. Okay. Now I want to remind you that we are not selling the treatment on the phone. We are selling the appointment. And there's a really subtle distinction with this, but it's subtle enough that it makes a massive difference. When we're focused on selling the treatment, we can run into all sorts of objections that we can't possibly deal with. So if a patient has a specific problem that we can't possibly be able to diagnose over the phone, we're going to be in a position where we're at a loss to be able to handle their concerns. What we need to do instead is we need to invite them to a consultation to get that question answered. So a very, very useful way of dealing with this is simply by saying, if they ask a question that you find difficult to answer, or you might even know the answer, but don't want to necessarily get into that level of detail, is to say, well, that's a great question. Thank you very much for asking it. What I think is best is that you come into the appointment and ask that question of the doctor, who will be able to give you an answer that will be suitable just for you. I could happily give you information from a website or a brochure that is suitable for everybody, but I think you'd probably be more interested in an answer that really relates to your situation. Am I right? So using that kind of language will help people understand that the appointment really has value. It's not just a stepping stone. It really has to happen in order for us to take the next step, which is the treatment, to get to the solution that they're after, which comes after the treatment. Step by step. So we're not really after selling the treatment at this stage. We're after selling the appointment. So I want you to think about different reasons as to why the appointment is valuable. The appointment itself has great value, even if it's free. Even more value if it's free, to be honest. But even if it's paid or whether it's free, the appointment has value. What kind of things are important? Well, it's a first step. You can't actually proceed down the pathway without the appointment. So it is the first step in understanding whether or not this is something that the patient wants to do and whether they're even suitable for it. They might find that it might solve the problem for them right then and there. They might find that the appointment is all they need in order to understand whether or not they can proceed or not. So that might solve a problem. Additionally, it identifies the next steps. Next steps might be different for every patient. So it gives them good quality professional information that helps them make decisions as to how to plan forward. In addition to that, we want to make sure that it gives the patients an opportunity to learn more about the clinic, to visit the people that they might be doing business with. All of that has value. Sometimes for patients, one of the greatest pieces of value that they can achieve from the appointment is the feeling of accomplishment that they understand now what has to happen. They can stop worrying. They can stop being anxious. Is this right for me? Should I do it? What are the questions I should ask? Should I be concerned? Instead, they can get the answers that they need answered. They can have everything understood, and they can walk away from the appointment with a lot more peace of mind than they walked into it from the beginning. So those are the values in the appointment. Now, moving forward, we need to talk a little bit about how to offer options. What we want to do is we want to offer broad to narrow options. And what I mean by that is we want to narrow times to maximize efficiency. So, for example, instead of somebody it's just simply just picking a date out of the air, or even asking them the worst question possible, which is, so do you want to come in? We want to talk a little bit more about when do you want to come in, as opposed to do you want to come in, because that can't be answered with a yes or no question. Similarly, we don't want to ask them, do you have a date in mind? They might not. They might not have any idea what your calendar is like. So you want to give them some brackets in which to work around. So those brackets might be around the months that they might want to come in next. Now, you remember that we talked a little bit about the next step in the 10th question of the opening. And because we've done that, we can then therefore narrow the brackets around what might be most suitable for them to have the treatment, or the treatment by, and also the appointment with respect to their deadline. So we might say to them, well, what works better for you, January or February? Because we know that their appointment should happen within those 2 months if they're going to reach their deadline. So beyond that, we might say, well, they might say January. Then we might say, well, early or late January, which would you prefer? Again, we're narrowing, right? We're going from broad to narrow. When they turn around and they say, I'd like it early January, you can say, okay, well, early or later in the week. We have appointments on Mondays, we have appointments near Fridays. Which one would work better for you? And then we can proceed now, when we got a date of the week, we can say morning or afternoon. Which one works better for you? Again, what we're doing is we're narrowing the option in an inverted pyramid to the point of funneling them into a decision. Now, this might sound quite basic. The reason we do it this way is because if we go through the hunt and peck method of choosing an appointment from the calendar, many patients might become exasperated at the whole idea, because they say one date, then they can't do it, then you say another date, then you can't do that. And some patients I've heard on the phone get so frustrated with the appointment setting process that they even will turn around and change their decision. They'll change their mind and they say, you know what, it's too complicated. I might as well just wait. I'll put it off and wait till later. That's definitely not what you want. You want to make sure that we give patients a funneled approach at making their appointment. So after morning or afternoon, what we want to get into then is the choice of time. We might say 2 or 4 p.m., depending, of course, if you have that time. And that's how we funnel an appointment down. Again, the principle here at play is offering broad to narrow options to get to an efficient appointment booking. Now, the next step is dates and times first. We want to make sure that we already have a date and time in mind now, and we want to say to the patient, okay, I have this date and time, and I have that date and time. Which one works better for you? So you might say, I have next Tuesday or the following Wednesday. Which one works better for you? We want to always give patients a choice. Asking a choice question helps them narrow things down in one answer or the other, as opposed to making them do all the work, which means trying to identify a date that might suit you both. This is great, because if you start going down this process, what they'll do on the phone is they'll open up their diary and they will start actually looking through their diary to identify dates. Once that happens, you know that we're very, very clear we're probably going to have an appointment here. They're starting to commit. You don't want to ask, would you like to book an appointment? I hear this all the time. We want to avoid that question at all cost. Would you like to book an appointment is not a sales question. That's a fact-based question. It can be answered with all sorts of answers like, I want to think about it, or not at this time. Instead, I want to offer the patient an option of this appointment or that appointment. It makes the decision much easier. I also would avoid asking, do you want to look at some dates? We have to be clear. The reason they called us, okay, is because they want to proceed to the after. They want to proceed to the solution. We don't want to, asking them if they want dates at this time is almost like somebody walking into a restaurant, sitting down at the table, and then the waiter coming up to them and saying, do you want to eat here? Well, of course they do. That's why they came into the restaurant. So we want to completely assume that they want to take the next step. They want to move forward with the appointment. We have to assume the close. Assume that this is the next step and it makes sense for them. Let them tell you that it's not for them. Don't assume it for them. Now, the next principle is transactions and how they follow commitments. Once you got a date and time in the schedule, and this is really important, you get the date and the time in the schedule first. Then, if you charge for appointments, and some people do, I'm not against it, I think it's a good idea, in fact, then you follow the date and time, what's in the diary, with a transaction. Then you ask for which credit card they'd like to use, or whether they'd like to pay with it by debit or credit. You don't get this first and then get the date, okay? You get the date and time in the calendar first, then ask for the transaction. And here's why. What you're doing here is you're actually offering them something in place. You're offering them a date and a time. You're putting it in their diary. If they want to keep that date and time, they have to pay, okay? Again, this is only if you charge for an appointment. If you don't charge for an appointment, you can ignore this part. But if you charge for an appointment, and I do recommend that you do, then you get the date and time first, and then you ask for the credit card information. Okay. Once the date and time's in there, they're much, much more likely to want to hand over the payment at that stage. So if you want to collect payments for the appointment, get the date and time in the diary first. Then it's the onus is on them to keep that date and time. Now they might turn around and say, well, okay, this is all very interesting, but now that we got this date and time, can you hold that for me while I go think about it and talk to somebody else? Listen, that's completely fine. I would say, look, that's no problem at all. I understand that you might need to talk to somebody. Do you mind telling me a little bit more about what it is that you're thinking about? Do you have any questions that have been left unanswered? Get clarification on what they want to think about. Now, this is really getting into objection handling territory, and I have a whole course, live and on video, about objection handling. So I don't want to get into too much detail now, but I think it's really, really important at this stage to know that you just don't simply take I want to think about it as an answer. You've spent now 15, 20 minutes on the phone with this person. The thinking time should have happened on that phone call. We're just talking about an appointment after all. We're not talking about the actual treatment. So we want to make sure we understand what has been left unanswered, what's still to decide, what's there to think about. We don't want to ask those questions necessarily, but we want to clarify what is it that they're thinking about, what is it that is left unanswered. Now, let's assume that they still decide they want to think about it. They want to just leave that appointment booked in, penciled in, if you like, before they make the final commitment. That's fine, but I would say something like this. I would say, listen, I can hold on to this appointment for you if you wish. I'm happy to do so, but the system boots it out within 24 hours after I've booked it. Now, that may be true or not, but the point is that you have to let them know that appointment won't sit there in perpetuity forever just waiting for them to make up their minds. That appointment needs to be given to somebody else who is more ready to make that commitment. So without necessarily telling them that you're going to remove the appointment, sometimes I like to suggest that policy dictates that we can only hold on to appointments for a limited time until we get payment or until we get some kind of commitment. And then that appointment has to go to somebody else should they want to. Most people will understand that. And some people, when told that, might actually turn around and just say, okay, fine, let's book it. Here's my credit card. Now, again, all of this only applies if you're taking payments on the phone. Now, let me just explain to you a little example of a situation that I've seen firsthand that shows me that payments on the phone can be very easy to collect. I worked with a clinic almost 10 years ago now who never took payments on the phone. They offered free initial screenings. They didn't have any problems with that. However, their conversion rate at the appointment wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. And these appointments were 3 hours in length. So they were giving away a lot of time. Also, when they wanted to upgrade the patient to the next step, they had to actually introduce the notion of the paid appointment right then when the patient was already visiting, and had to offer that patient that paid appointment at the moment where they had to make an on-spot decision to stay or not stay. Now, that's fine, and it's a particular way this clinic worked. It's interesting because we had a training session, and we were talking about the notion of collecting payments. We didn't actually say you should collect payments, but one of the salespeople decided that maybe it was a good idea, and she thought that I actually encouraged her to take payments on the phone. So she proceeded to start taking credit cards on the phone. The interesting thing that happened was that it worked. She started collecting payments on the phone, and people started giving her the credit cards. And these weren't cheap payments either. They were £500. So basically what she was doing is she was asking for the money in order to hold that appointment for £500 before the patient had ever even seen the clinic or met anybody there. Today, they do this as a standard. They do this every time. And today, 8 out of 10 people that walk into the clinic are prepaid. You can imagine what that does for their do not show rate. You can imagine what that does for the level of consistency. You can imagine what that does for somebody's motivation. Once they've paid, they're on that bus and they're going to ride it all the way to its destination. So the consultations themselves are relatively easy. The patient's already decided more or less that they're ready to go forward and have exercised that right or that interest by actually paying for a deposit. Now, a part of that payment is refundable should they not be suitable for the procedure. But that's more of a policy decision on their part. I think it's great. If you can get a treatment, or rather, if you can get a deposit in exchange for an appointment, I encourage you to do so. It is especially important if you have a high do not show rate, or if you're offering very, very expensive time and long appointments to patients for free. Now, when you ask for the credit card, I think it's important to also ask with a closed-ended choice. What we want to do is we don't just simply say, do you want to pay for that appointment? If we're asking for money, we want to ask them how they want to pay. So I might ask something like, how would you like to pay for that appointment? Would you like to put it on your debit card or your credit card? Alternatively, I might say something like, would you like an invoice for that appointment sent to you through the mail or through the post or through the email? Doing it that way allows us to get through that whole assumption. The payment really isn't a choice. It's just how do they want to do it and how do they want to get the receipt. So that's what I would suggest in terms of actually following a commitment with a transaction. Important in all of this is making a good proposal. And how I would go about doing this, as soon as you're done with the opening, what I would do is I would transition into the next part of Act 3, starting with making a proposal. So once you've got the timing question answered, I would then at that point suggest you to say to the patient on the phone, given the information you've provided me with so far, here is what I recommend. Okay, I'll repeat that. Given the information you've provided me so far, here's what I recommend. And now what you would say is, you've told me about the problem that you have. You've also told me about the solution that you're looking for. And lastly, you've told me about when you want to have it all done, when you want to have this problem solved. Here's what I recommend. I have this date and I have that date. You can come in and see us. We'll examine you. We'll do everything that's necessary to give you good advice as to what the next step is. How does that sound? Which one is better for you? And allow them to make that choice on the date. Once you've done that, you're well on your way without having to do any more closing. If you've done your job in the opening, you're very, very likely at this point to have them well motivated so that they want one of those dates. Effectively, what you've done is you said, I've listened to you, I know what you're asking for, I know we can solve it, and I know when we can solve it. Now, the choice really is which date you choose, and then followed by how do you want to pay, if that's what you do.